They never asked me what I thought. Not when the boats came, not when the masters counted heads in the morning light, not when the boy they called Huck and I set off downriver under a sky that never quite promised mercy. My name is James. Folks call me Jim, and this is the story they never let me tell. You might think you know the tale, a white boy and a runaway slave drifting down the Mississippi dodging danger and speaking in riddles. But that version, that's just what stayed in print. The truth, it lives somewhere else. It lives in the quiet places, behind Huck's words, beneath the water, and inside the long silences I carried with me. I wasn't born knowing I was less than any man. That kind of knowledge, it's taught, not born. It came in pieces, in the way folks looked through me, not at me, in the bruises that faded but never vanished. In the way I learned to read a man's mood before he opened his mouth, just to stay whole another day. I remember the morning I ran, my feet hit the wet earth before my mind even knew I'd made a decision. It wasn't planned like a soldier's march, it was instinct. Like a bird finding a break in the sky. I'd overheard Miss Watson talking about selling me downriver, and that word sell, it clung to me like smoke. You sell tobacco, you sell hogs, you don't sell people. But they did, all the time. And so I ran. At first it was just me and the trees, me and my breath. Me and the cold realization that the world behind me didn't want me free, and the world ahead didn't care. But I kept going, not for the promise of freedom, I didn't even know what that felt like, but for the chance, the possibility, the unknown, which somehow felt safer than what I already knew. I hid on an island, Jackson's Island, where the birds didn't ask questions and the river kept secrets. That's where Huck found me. Or maybe I found him. Either way, our paths were bound from that moment forward. He was running too, though he'd never admit it the same way I did. Said he wanted out from under his pap and the widow's civilizing. But running is running, no matter how pretty the reason. I'd always known Huck was different. Not like the others. He didn't look at me with disgust or pity. He looked at me like I was a person. Which might sound simple, but back then it was everything. We built a raft, patched it up with stolen wood and blind hope, and let the river take us where it pleased. The current, it don't listen to men. It has its own path, and it'll drag you down if you don't learn to move with it. Days turned into weeks, nights stretched, long and silent, broken only by the slap of water and the occasional owl. I taught Huck how to read the stars, the old way. The way passed down by whispers, not books. He taught me how to listen better, not just to words, but to what folks weren't saying. We'd drift past towns glowing with lanterns, hear the fiddle music of people who would have strung me up without a second thought. I'd keep low, my heart a drum in my chest. Huck would sometimes stare at them like he didn't understand, and maybe he did. Maybe the luxury of his skin was never having to understand. Still he stayed by me. Lied for me, risked more than I expected, but never more than I did. One night we stopped near a town where I overheard a group of men talking about a reward. Said they'd seen a raft and a nigger on board. My chest locked up. I wanted to scream, but I just sank lower into the shadow of the trees. Huck saw my face and didn't ask questions. He just said, "We move at dawn." That night I couldn't sleep. I sat by the fireless spot we called our camp and thought about my wife, my children. I thought about how they might be waking up, not even knowing I was still breathing under the same sky. I thought about the weight of silence and how it had always been my cage. It was then that I made a promise, not just to get free, but to tell my story, to hold it in my hands like a weapon, or a light, something no one could take from me. I didn't have fancy words. Still don't, but I had memory. I had pain. I had truth. And truth, even when whispered, has a way of sticking. The river gave me that. It didn't care who I was. It didn't ask for papers or permission. It just kept moving. And maybe that's what freedom is. Movement, a refusal to stay put in the place others said you belong. Huck and I, we saw things. We lived through storms, both the kind that soaked your bones and the kind that lived inside men. We crossed paths with frauds, preachers, drunks, slave catchers, widows, liars and dreamers. Each one of them carved a little something into it. There was a man who tried to sell me for reward money, even after I saved his son from drowning. Said it was business. Said he needed the cash. I looked him in the eye and told him he was already poor. He didn't understand. But Huck did. I saw it in the way his shoulders tightened, like he'd finally felt the rope that always hung behind my steps. We kept moving. The raft, once a symbol of escape, started feeling more like a home than any land I'd ever known. It wasn't because it was safe. It wasn't. It was because it was ours. One morning, as fog curled off the river like breath, Huck asked me if I believed things would ever change. I told him change ain't something that just happens. It's something you fight for. You push the wheel, you carve the new path, and you bleed, if you have to. He nodded. Then he asked if I'd ever go back. I told him I never really left. My body, maybe, but my people, my past, they ride with me, in my voice, in my steps, in every refusal to bow. And that's the thing about stories. They can chain you or they can free you. This one, it's about freedom. Not the kind written on papers, not the kind that comes with cannon blasts and grand speeches, the quiet kind, the kind that starts with a decision and grows into a life. There's a strange comfort in drifting, not because you're safe, but because nothing's fixed. When you're drifting, even the pain doesn't stay still long enough to catch you. That's how it felt most mornings on the river. Huck would stretch and groan like the world owed him more sleep, and I'd already be watching the banks, waiting for danger to take shape. I never told him how many times I thought of slipping away in the night, quiet as mist, just me and my feet, and the darkness. It wasn't him I feared, it was what followed him. The eyes that trailed us from the trees, the assumptions sewn into every white face we passed. I knew I couldn't outrun those eyes, but some nights I still thought I had to try. But I didn't, because something was changing, in me, in him, in the raft itself. One day, we came upon a steamboat docked crooked in the mud, half-torn canvas, a busted paddle wheel, looked like it had been picked over by raccoons and regret. Huck wanted to explore it, said maybe there was food or dry tobacco left behind. I wanted to keep moving, but curiosity, especially in boys, has its own current. So we climbed aboard, Huck leading the way like he had something to prove. He always moved faster than his thinking. Me, I moved with caution, with memory. That wreck could have been a trap, could have been a tomb, could have been both. Inside, the walls were warped from water, and the air was thick with mold and old blood. I could feel stories clinging to the beams, stories of people who didn't make it off that boat. Huck poked around with the eager eyes of someone who hadn't learned that history isn't always dead. Sometimes it waits. We found a trunk near the captain's quarters, locked. Huck wanted to bust it open. I told him we needed to leave it. He said, "Why? You scared of ghosts?" I said, "I'm scared of greed." That shut him up for a moment. Still, he pried it open with a broken oar. Inside were books, soaked, ruined mostly, and a pistol wrapped in cloth. Huck's eyes lit up like he'd found treasure. I saw something else. Proof of ownership, of violence, of men who thought their word was law because they could write it down and enforce it with bullets. He held the pistol up, asked if I wanted. I told him I'd already been shot once in this life. Didn't need to carry a second round in my pocket. He didn't get it, not fully, but he respected it. And that was enough. We left the boat with nothing but silence between us. That silence carried for miles down the river. Later that week, we came across a man named Travis. Tall, with a voice that slid like oil, and eyes that never blinked long enough to show you what he was hiding. He offered us food in exchange for help pulling up fish traps along the bayou, said we looked road-worn, and on. That second part was a lie.
but the food was real. So we agreed. Travis fed us greasy catfish and flat cornbread, told stories that felt rehearsed, talked about his days as a soldier, how he'd fought for states' rights and lost his family farm to carpetbaggers. I noticed he never asked where we were from. That meant he either knew or didn't care. The second night, while Huck slept by the fire, Travis leaned in close and asked me something that made my stomach twist. He said, "You ever think of going back to work? Bet a strong man like you could fetch a good wage up north, or a good bounty down here."
I didn't answer, just stood up and walked into the woods. He didn't follow. He didn't need to. The threat was already planted. I woke Huck up before dawn, told him we had to go. No debate. Just go. He grumbled, but didn't argue. That's the thing about trust. It grows quiet, like roots. You don't always see it happening until it holds fast when you need it. We pushed the raft out before the fog lifted. The water was still, like it knew something had just been avoided. I didn't speak for hours. Not because I was scared. I'd passed scared miles ago. I was angry. Angry at how close I'd come to trusting a man who saw me as a walking paycheck. That night, I asked Huck what he would have done if Travis had turned me in. He didn't answer at first. Then he said, "I'd have gone with you. Wherever they put you, I'd follow, 'cause if you're not free, then neither am I." That's the first time I felt like someone saw me, not as a servant, not as a sidekick, as a person. I didn't cry, couldn't. My tears had dried up long before that. But something inside me loosened, like a knot finally giving way. In the days that followed, we passed by a town staging a parade, not for freedom, not for harvest, for capture. They were celebrating the return of a runaway, a man they'd caught and dragged back in chains. Folks cheered, kids waved flags. The man didn't look up. Huck wanted to watch. I couldn't bear it. I turned my back and faced the river, because that wasn't justice. That was a performance, and I'd been part of enough of those to know how they ended. There's something people don't talk about enough, the silence of pain, not the screaming, not the fighting, the quiet after, the kind where you hold your breath, just to keep your dignity. That man, in chains, was holding that kind of silence. Later I asked Huck what he saw in that parade. He said, "A lesson." I didn't press him. We all learn different things from the same moment. Some see glory, some see warning. I saw myself. One evening, we came upon a woman living alone in a crumbling house near the banks. She invited us in with a wary smile and a shotgun near the door. Her name was Clara. Said she didn't trust travelers, but trusted a dog less, and he seemed to like us. She offered us a meal, boiled greens, dry cornbread, and sassafras tea. Told us her husband had died in the war, and her sons moved north. Said she stayed behind because she didn't like the way freedom felt up there. Too fast, too loud. Clara didn't ask me if I was a runaway, didn't ask Huck if he was a thief. She just watched us eat, like she was measuring our souls by how we held our spoons. That night, she let us sleep in the barn. As I lay on the straw, listening to Huck snore soft and steady, Clara came to the door and leaned in. She said, "I hope you make it. I hope you both make it. The river don't give many second chances." Then she was gone. In the morning, she left us a small sack of dried beans and a flask of water. No goodbyes, just quiet kindness. Sometimes, that's louder than anything else. As we drifted on, I thought about all the lives we'd touched, and how many of them wouldn't even remember us. That's the way of people like me. We pass through stories, but rarely get to tell our own. But this journey, mine and Huck's, it wasn't just about escape. It was about becoming. I started to see myself not just as a man on the run, but as a man rewriting the way he was remembered. And in doing that, I realized something simple but heavy. Freedom isn't just a place, it's a voice. And I was learning to use mine. The river changed that week. The air grew thicker, the sky darker, The trees taller, like they were leaning in to listen. Everything felt closer, like the world had decided we'd drifted long enough, and now it was time to test if we still wanted it bad enough. Huck noticed it too. He got quiet, not the usual lazy boy quiet. This was something deeper, like he was holding a secret between his teeth and afraid that speaking it would make it real. I didn't push. Boys like Huck, they talk when they're ready. And sure enough, one morning, while we were chewing on jerky and bread crust, he looked at me and said, "I had a dream last night. You were gone. I was alone, and the raft sank." I just nodded, didn't say what I was thinking, that he was already dreaming a version of what the world was plotting. Dreams don't lie. They just speak in code. We kept going south, though it felt like the river was pulling us somewhere we hadn't chosen. There's a weight that builds up when you know something's coming, but don't know from which direction. That's how I felt the morning the patrol boat showed up. We'd stopped near a bend to gather some wild greens, and I saw the smoke first, thin gray, curling above the trees like a warning. Huck saw it next. He froze, eyes wide, jaw tight. I don't think I've ever seen him look so much like a boy, not a clever river rat, not a trickster, just a scared child who suddenly realized the game had real stakes. We ducked low and pushed the raft into the brush, praying the river would keep our secret one more time. From the reeds we watched them pass, 3 men, wide hats, long guns, laughing like they were hunting something they didn't expect to fight back. One of them was whittling, another was drinking. The third, he had the look of someone who used to catch folks like me for fun, not duty. They didn't see us, not that time, but something changed after that. I started waking in the middle of the night, gripping a stick like it was a blade. My body remembered the days of chains. My ears tuned themselves to every rustle, every bird call out of place. I stopped eating full meals. Huck tried to cheer me up. He even did this terrible little jig he'd made up as a kid. But nothing could cut through what I was carrying, because I knew the end was getting close, not the end of life, the end of the run, the moment when you have to decide what kind of man you are, the moment when running turns into choosing, and choosing, well, it always has a cost. That night, I told Huck a story I'd never said out loud, about the time I was 8, and watched my uncle dragged off in the night for teaching a neighbor's child how to read. He'd whispered the alphabet by candlelight for weeks, said if you could name the letters, you could name yourself. That frightened folks more than anything. A man with no papers but his own mind. Now that was dangerous. They whipped him till he forgot the alphabet, or pretended to. Then they sold him south. I never saw him again. Huck listened without a word. Then he said something I'll never forget. "Maybe that's why you talk like books now. You carry his memory in your mouth." And just like that, I felt stronger, not because of his words exactly, but because I realized something. Every step I'd taken, every lie told to protect me, every word I'd swallowed to survive, none of it had erased who I was. In fact, it had carved me deeper. The next day, we met a woman named Miss Della. She was standing at the edge of the river, pulling laundry from the shallows, her hands red from cold water and hard years. She didn't flinch when she saw me, didn't pause when Huck stepped off the raft, just looked us both over and said, "You hungry or lost?" We said both. She brought us into her yard, where a crooked porch leaned like it had arthritis. Her cabin was plain, 1 chair, 1 bed, a fire that barely warmed the room, but the soup she made tasted like something ancient, like it remembered kindness. She didn't ask names, she didn't offer hers, just said, "You need rest before the next leg," and I got enough space in the barn for 2. That night, I woke to find her sitting on a crate outside the barn, just watching the stars. I joined her. She said, "You don't smell like a man who's running anymore. You smell like a man who's about to stop." I didn't answer at first. Then I said, "What if stopping means going backward?" She nodded slow. Then maybe backward is the only place left to push forward from. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, we thanked her and pushed off again. The river was wide, open, and quiet.
The kind of quiet that comes before something changes. That's when Huck said he wanted to go back. Not home. Just back up the river. He said he'd had enough run. Said the raft felt less like freedom and more like floating without purpose. I asked him what purpose he thought we had. He said, "I don't know, but I think you do." I didn't answer, because I did know. I knew I had to find my family, not just dream about, not just hope the wind would blow news of them to my ears. I had to go back for them, or forward, or sideways, whatever direction the truth lived in. I told Huck he didn't have to follow. He said, "I know, but I will." We drifted in silence after that. Later that day, we reached a fork in the river. One path led further south, toward danger, swamps and tighter chains. The other curved west, toward uncertain towns and rumors of freedom. I turned the raft west.
That night we burned the old map Huck had been carrying, not because it was wrong, but because we were done letting other men tell us where to go. As the fire ate the paper, I thought of all the names that had passed through my life like leaves on water. The names I'd been called, the ones I wasn't allowed to say, the ones I whispered to myself just to feel real again. And I made another promise, that I would name myself, that I would choose who I became. Not because I was free, but because I was becoming. Becoming is harder than running. It demands more than legs. It asks for memory, for pain, for a voice. And I had all three. You never really know you've changed until you circle back to where you started, and the place don't fit you no more. The raft drifted slower now, not because the current had eased, but because there wasn't panic in our bones. There was intention. Every bend of the river felt like a memory we hadn't yet earned. And then came the letter. We met a traveling preacher at a trading post, not the kind who preached fire and fury, but the kind who traded in stamps and sorrow. He was lugging a cart filled with papers, candles and pocket Bibles. Huck struck up a conversation. Huck always talked when I stayed silent, and the man said he'd just passed through a town up north that had posted word about a missing man named James. Not a runaway, not a thief, just a missing man. That was all it said. And tucked inside the edge of his cart, folded twice and sealed with wax, was a letter, addressed to James if ever he be found, from L. He handed it to me like it weighed nothing, but when I took it, I nearly dropped it. My hands shook, not from fear, but from the force of being remembered. I waited to open it. I don't know why. Maybe because part of me wanted to freeze that moment, the part where hope was still whole and unbroken, where the words inside hadn't yet hurt me. But I opened it. Loved one. I write in the dark, not knowing if you breathe the same air or walk beneath the same sun. I have waited through seasons, through storms, through silence, believing your feet would find the road home. The baby is taller now, asking questions I can't answer. She stares at the river, like she's waiting for it to speak your name. If you live, come. If you are free, come. If you are not, I will find you anyway. L. I didn't read it to Huck. I just handed it to him. He read it slow, lips moving, eyes softening as he reached the end. Then he handed it back, said, "What are we waiting for?" And just like that, our direction changed again. We headed north, not along the main river anymore, but up the narrow streams, the quiet backways where the map fades and the memory guides. It was harder. The current fought us. The brush clawed at us. We slept less, ate less, talked more. Huck started asking questions that went deeper than river bends or weather. What was your daughter's name? Do you think people can really change? If we find them, what'll you say first? I answered as best I could. Her name was Lottie, like her mother. I think people can learn. Learning's harder than changing. I'll say I'm sorry, and I'll mean it. We came upon a town one dusk, where every building leaned like it wanted to leave, but couldn't afford the journey. A blacksmith sat on his porch sharpening blades for tools that looked like they hadn't been used since harvest. When he saw me, he squinted, not with suspicion, but with memory. "You Everett's boy?" he asked. That stopped me cold. Everett had been my father's name, a man I barely remembered, but whose shadow I'd been living in for years. I nodded. The blacksmith spat to the side, wiped his hands. "You walk like him, proud, but cautious. He used to come through here trading salted fish and story." He didn't say more, didn't need to, just nodded toward a dusty path behind his shop and said, "Keep going. You're close." We did. That night we camped near an old sycamore with a split trunk that looked like an open mouth screaming upward. I told Huck the story of how I met Lottie's mother, how she worked in the kitchen of a house I once served in, how her laughter used to break through the walls like sunlight, how we carved our initials into that very tree, long before we knew what it meant to lose each other. I told him about the night I left, how I kissed her forehead and promised I'd send for her, how I failed. Huck didn't say much, just listened. Sometimes that's the best thing a friend can do, hold your pain without trying to fix it. By morning the air had changed. It smelled like memory, like burnt sugar and old wood, like home, before home became something you had to steal back. We walked the last few miles, not floated. Walked, and every step closer I felt more afraid, not of punishment, not of the law, afraid of being forgotten, of becoming a ghost in the eyes of the ones who once knew me best. The house was still there, smaller than I remembered, but standing. The shutters crooked, the roof patched with scrap tin, the door open, and there she stood. Lottie, older, worn, but standing tall. She didn't cry, neither did I. She just walked down the steps, stopped 3 feet from me, and looked at my face like she was trying to line it up with a dream she'd held too long. Then she said, "Took you long enough." I laughed. I don't know why. Maybe because it was the last thing I expected her to say. Maybe because it was perfect. I said, "I didn't walk here. I drifted, stumbled and survived my way back." She nodded. "That sounds like you." And then finally, she reached out and touched my hand, and I was home. But the story didn't end there, because freedom, real freedom, doesn't end with reunion. It begins with restoration. It means rebuilding what was torn down. It means learning your daughter's favorite song, how she likes her porridge, what she fears in the dark. It means sitting with silence that isn't empty, but earned. Huck stayed for a week, then he left, said he had more river to see. He hugged me like a brother, whispered, "You found what you were looking for." I said, "No. I found what I thought I'd lost." And as he walked away, whistling low and off-key, I realized I wasn't angry anymore. Not at the world, not at Huck, not even at myself, because I had a name. I had a voice, and I was finally using both. Mornings felt different after the return. They weren't filled with urgency anymore. No whispers of footsteps behind me. No need to sleep with one eye open. I still woke early, not from fear, but from habit. A survivor's clock rarely resets. It just learns a new rhythm. Each morning I'd rise before the sun and sit on the old porch with a tin cup of weak coffee. Sometimes Lottie joined me. Sometimes she didn't. We didn't need words between us every day. Some days, silence said enough. That's how you know you're with the right person, when silence don't feel empty. Lottie's eyes carried years I missed, not in bitterness, just in truth. She had raised our daughter through seasons of not knowing. Through war, through rumors, through the absence of my voice. And still, she stood, still, she laughed, not as often, but when it came it was real. Our daughter Lottie Jr. was 10, but she looked older,
not in face, but in how she watched people. Quiet, studied. She asked few questions at first. Mostly just stared at me like she was building a map from the way I moved, spoke. She was trying to figure out if the man who had returned was made of the same story she'd been told. And I let her, because trust ain't owed just because blood runs similar. It's earned. One day, I was fixing the barn roof, and she came and handed me nails, didn't say a word, just held the box and stood in the sun with her eyes squinting, watching every hammer swing like it was a spell. That was the beginning. Not dramatic, not weepy, just real, and real was all I wanted. We never went back to the river. Not the raft, not the trade routes, not the escape routes. Huck wrote letters, sloppy handwriting, wanderer's voice. Said he'd seen the Pacific Ocean. Said it was so big and quiet it scared him a little. Said he'd joined a group of folks, learning how to build cabins, and wanted to teach them what I'd taught him about fire, ropes, reading the sky. I wrote him back once a month. I told him how the beans were growing, how Lottie was healing, how my daughter had finally let me teach her to read. She liked stories about explorers and women who made maps. I told her about the constellations, about how the North Star never moves, and how once upon a time I followed it to freedom. She said, "You didn't follow it, Daddy. You chased it," and maybe that was true. Life slowed in a way I'd never imagined possible, but even in the stillness, I kept learning, kept growing. Because that's what freedom really is, the right to grow without permission. I built bookshelves, filled them with pages I could finally read in the open. I taught kids in the area to write their names, even when their parents said it was a waste. I told them, "Your name in your own hand is the first piece of land you'll ever own." Some believed me.
Others laughed. Didn't matter. I kept teaching. One boy asked me once, "Why don't you ever talk about the bad things, about when you were owned?" I said, "Because I'm more than what was done to me." That night I sat by the fire and thought about all the names I'd worn: slave, runaway, thief, invisible. And then I thought of the names I'd earned: father, teacher, free man, friend. And I realized something. The world didn't give me those. I carved them out with my own hands. One evening, while walking past the river's edge, not the big river, just a quiet stream near the edge of the property, I found an old piece of driftwood, weathered, split, smooth in the middle where water had taken its toll. I carved a word into it. Not my name, just one word. Still, because that's what I was now. Still here. Still standing. Still learning. Not frozen. Just no longer running. The final letter Huck sent came with a drawing, a messy sketch of the raft, the one we'd shared. He'd drawn it the way he remembered it, stronger than it ever was, straighter, cleaner. But it made me smile. He wrote, "That raft was a world. You were the compass. Thanks for steering." I kept that letter. I never replied to it. Not because I didn't want to, but because sometimes a story don't need another chapter. It just needs peace. And peace had finally arrived. Years passed. Lottie Jr. grew into her name. She carved her own space in the world, fierce, curious, unwilling to be forgotten. She eventually left for the north, to teach in a school where names still held weight and freedom, still had to be proven. She wrote back, said, "You gave me more than a father. You gave me a beginning." I cried when I read that. Not loud, just quiet tears that felt warm and old, like a river I'd finally stepped out of for good. The house changed too. Boards replaced. Roof patched again. New hinges. Time wore things down. But we kept building back, and every now and then a child or a traveler would come by, asking if I was James from the book. I'd smile and say, Depends which version you've read. Because in their stories, I was still a sidekick, a shadow in Huck's tale. But in mine, I was the light. And that was enough. One fall evening, as the leaves began to drop in little golden spirals, I sat on the porch with my granddaughter in my lap. She asked, "What did the river sound like when you were my age?" I told her, it sounded like fear and hope and the wind saying run. But now, it just sounds like water. She didn't understand. Not yet. But one day, she would. And when she did, I hoped she'd truly know, that her story didn't begin with chains. It began with a choice to live, to remember, to speak, because silence might protect a man for a time. But voice gives him back the world. And so the river carried him, not into escape, but into existence, not away from who he was, but into who he became. James did not vanish into the pages of another man's story. He wrote his own, and through each word, each breath, each name he reclaimed, he reminded us, freedom is not an ending. It is the beginning of everything.